In a world where it seems totally normal to listen to a podcast about the Toronto Argonauts, it's the X's and Argos podcast.
Welcome to the X's and Argos podcast. Ben Grant, joined as always by JB. This episode brought to you by Funny Bone Broth, now available at Nature's Emporium in Newmarket, and they are entirely restocked at Italy. JB, we got a big week this week. The decision to shut down the season by the CFL was made. Talk to me. Initial thoughts.
Not surprising, I don't think, to anybody who was watching things unfold. You know, the government was clearly sending messages that they were not going to give the CFL free money, and the CFL definitely wanted free money. So it's not surprising. I mean, I think it's exactly what the players thought would happen when the CFL had no plan and they kept kind of kicking the can down the road. I think the CFL thought it had more leverage over the federal government than it did.
Yeah, there seemed to be a little bit of arrogance here, and I wasn't expecting there to be a deal. Like when we had Naylor on last week, he talked about the fact that, well, he gave it about a 10% shot of actually coming through, and that's a guy that's pretty plugged into things. And so, I felt pretty similarly. But then on Friday, some good news started coming out. It looked like, maybe this would get put together, but then that got shut down pretty quickly. And, from a government standpoint, like the governments just get killed for giving money to sports franchises. Like you remember it happening, I think it was back in the 90s with Canadian NHL teams. And the public perception of that overall isn't good. People don't like when the government is giving money to sports franchises.
I think that's changed. I think that people, the idea of giving a free loan to a sports franchise that day has gone. And maybe the CFL owners didn't read the newspaper in the last 20 years. But it's not 1987. There was just no chance they were going to get a free bailout for a company without opening their books. I mean,
what do you think of the opening the books part, though? They're like, okay, well, let's look into this. Let's see your books and we'll talk about money. And they're like, no, let's just shut down.
and then they wanted a loan with no interest. And you're like, what? For who? Like, it's a classic, everybody's a capitalist until they need money. And then suddenly they're socialists.
So this obviously impacts players, families. It's a horrible situation for players, though, really, because they haven't been paid since last November in most cases. So few players have off-season bonuses that, these are essentially guys that have been working out, training nonstop. We see these videos that the guys are putting out. To be a professional athlete is not just like the 1970s where you show up at training camp and you're like, okay, well, let's get going. In this day and age, you have to spend your time. Your job in the off season is keeping in shape. And you see guys like Fabian Foote that are going at it every day, lifting hard, running, working out. And, these guys have been doing it essentially for free since November. And there's a real injustice there, I think.
Yeah, 100%. The league really betrayed the players. They knew and could have known in May that they were not going to get free money from the government. And nothing has changed. Nothing has developed. They just simply didn't care about the players, and they kicked the can down the road and kicked the can down the road. And now they've canceled the season, but they could have and should have done this in May. Either in May you decide we're going to play and we're not going to get government money and we're going to make the best of it, or we want government money, we didn't get it, we're shutting down the season. I mean, there's absolutely, the commissioner, I think, should be held account to this. Nothing has changed since May. They just didn't care about the players. And it's, I think the players have every right to be really angry because ownership treated them like cattle.
There's a conspiracy theory going around that the CFL waited until it was too late for players to join NFL camps to cancel the season. That if they had canceled the season in May, in June, these players who were on expiring contracts, and that's something that we'll have to get to later in this episode, would be able to go and latch on with NFL teams.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I don't disagree that the owners held on to their assets until they were devalued 100%. I mean, I think the owners need to, this is the thing. I mean, these franchises need to apologize. I mean, they're acting like victims, but they're not victims. They absolutely exploited and took advantage of their leverage and treated their players with no respect. Not as people who are valued members, but as indentured servants. I think it's really disgusting. I think the commissioner should go. And I think teams have to make amends, because what they've done here is really, really outrageous. And the players know it. I mean, most fans, I think, will probably just go, oh, well, they tried and then they canceled. But players know what was done to them. And I think this is going to be something that needs to be repaired, because I think the players rightfully believe that they were screwed by the league. And, I don't know why. I mean, I know why, employers don't care about their employees, but they need to have a relationship with these players moving forward. I hope that they can, come up with something that the players support in terms of contracts being recognized, or, some sort of arrangement. I think that needs to be done to repair this relationship, that they have to do right by the players in terms of what contracts will look like.
In talking to players over the last 24 hours, there's a lot of anger. They're angry at the situation, but one of the injustices that they are really upset about is the fact that everyone else is getting paid. And they look at it and they say, well, if this was a situation where the league isn't going, nobody's getting any money, that's horrible. But what's even worse is knowing that coaches are getting paid, that people working within the organization are getting paid, but players are not getting paid. And that is something that makes them really upset, because they feel now singled out. So everyone's getting paid but us, and they are the product.
Yeah, I agree with them. I mean, they have been so disrespected in this process, and the fact that they didn't do right by the players and canceled the season in May, is outrageous. It's outrageous that these franchises are pretending like this was the only time they can make the decision. I mean, nothing has changed. They could run the season if they want. They just don't want to. It's as simple as that. They just don't want to pay the players. They could do a bubble. They could run a shortened season. It isn't that they didn't get government money. They just don't want to pay the players. And that's fine. But they knew that in May, that they didn't want to pay the players.
Farhan Louji reported yesterday that the difference between playing and not playing financially was nothing. It was pretty much going to be the same thing in terms of they would have lost money either way. The amount of money lost really didn't add up to being the reason that they decided not to play, which is also interesting and horrifying.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, obviously, ownership is going to want their narrative out there. They're going to want to, you'll see over the next week, different things are going to be put out there. But, if it's the same, then they'd run it. I just don't believe them. I don't believe them. If it were the same, then run it. Why not run it? I just think that's not true. I think they just made a monetary decision.
Well, I think the risks with running it is that if they started to run the bubble and then it had to shut down, the deal that the players had actually negotiated for the bubble was pretty good. It actually sounded great when I looked through, what was sort of finally settled upon. And I think the reason for that is that there may not have been any intention of actually seeing this through, because the players had guarantees in there. They had, it was especially good for veteran players. Medical, of course, covered, and there were a lot of other details. You can find that online. But yeah, it looked really good from a player's perspective. Way better than the initial offer that we were talking about, where players were, going to be paid peanuts on the season. And I think maybe the owners looked at this and thought, well, if we do the bubble thing, we have to shut down, 1 or 2 weeks in, we're going to be out a lot more. Whereas if they saw the whole season through, that would have been sort of, negligible in terms of losses.
Yeah, I mean, I can see why they would want to cancel before starting and guaranteeing everybody's contract. But I mean, I think it boils down to, I mean, it boils down to, what do you think of the players? Are the players important to you, or are they just widgets in a factory? And, I think the CFL has clearly fallen on the side of, these are just factory workers, and we're going to close the factory, and I'm going to go to my golf course and play some golf. They did not do right by the players and did not treat the players as people who are caught up in this too, and valuable partners in this arrangement they have. The
players are going to remember this too. The next time the CBA is negotiated, you can be sure there's going to be language in there that the players insist upon, in terms of guarantees, in terms of what happens in the case of a canceled season, perhaps even the way in which players are paid. Right now, the way it's set up is that players generally get paid on a game-by-game basis, like once the season starts, and there are no payments made in the off-season. And that's something that they may look at restructuring, so that you don't end up in a situation like this where these guys haven't seen a dime since November of last year.
Clearly, when the owners came up with their list of considerations, what is right for the players never entered into that conversation. Because if it had, then they would have made a decision in May. And therefore letting the players either try and catch on in the NFL or just to know what their plans are for the summer and the fall.
I was pretty turned off watching the commissioner yesterday when he talked about, and really for the first time, saying that one of his priorities was getting players paid. And that's something that he's now going to look into and see that, players can get some money. And it just seems so disingenuous after this long process. Like, now this is what we're thinking about. And it just didn't come off as sincere. And I don't think any player saw that and thought, oh, good, we're very cared about.
No. Well, I mean, I think the commissioner carries as much weight as, Tony the Tiger does for Frosted Flakes. I don't think he's making decisions of any kind. So it's nice for him to weigh in on what his plan is. But I don't think that's going to get you a cup of coffee, that the commissioner's on the case. Thanks a lot.
There are also some players I've talked to over the last 24 hours that are really going to think hard about whether or not they want to continue as professional athletes. Players that are under contract for next year and players that aren't, that are now suddenly thinking, is this something that I want to do for a living? Is this what I want to do going forward? And I think you're going to see a lot of players, especially those with contracts that have expired, but even some whose contracts haven't expired, that are just going to decide, what? I know I'm only 26, 27, 28 years old, but that's enough, and I'm going to retire from the CFL unless there are dramatic changes. And I don't think there are going to be before next season, because the CBA is still goes through next year, even though they're going to have to sort a few things out with it.
Yeah, that's a very natural reaction. I think, I think the players, feel that the owners think the players have no leverage. Where are you going to go? Who's going to pay you this much? So I'm not worried about you quitting because I'm the one paying you to play football. Which is just a really, reductive and disrespectful mindset to have about players. It's sort of that. I mean, honestly, it's like kind of core plantation mentality that the players aren't partners. The players are, workers who do their thing for us, and they should just shut up and I'll pay them if I want, or I won't pay them if I don't want. And, I think it's really harmful. I think the way that the players have been treated is, something out of 1975. I had hoped labor relations had improved so that it wasn't so drastically, management and players and like a guy with a big cigar laughing at people. But it hasn't. I mean, this could have happened 35 years ago.
The difference, I think, when you look at the CFL versus other leagues where this kind of thing happens is that the amount of money we're talking about is vastly different. The attitude of, well, where else are you going to go? You can say that maybe in the NFL and, the NBA, the NHL, like where else are you going to go to play your sport? And maybe not in the NHL, actually, because there are other options. But in most professional North American sports, there really aren't other options where you're going to earn that much more money. But in this case, we're talking about people leaving not to play football, but to do something else, to start their life after football, which is something that CFL players have to plan for anyway, for the most part. And they're just going to get an earlier jump on it. These players that are leaving, they are going to make as much money that they were making in the CFL. They are going to make that amount of money doing something else. And so the leverage that the league may think it has here, I think, really isn't there.
Yeah, I think the owners have misread it. I agree. I think the owners feel they have leverage that they don't. I think that, I think there are lots of players who are going to feel really badly done by and are just going to leave.
And people will play, like they will find new players, but what's the league going to look like? What will that quality be? Because they're not going to get the best anymore.
I think that is definitely a risk. That, I mean, what would they do if 50% of the league decided they didn't want to play anymore?
They'll always be able to find people who will play. There's not a shortage of people that want to try professional football for any amount of money.
But what quality, right?
It's right, like, and that's the thing. And this is a league that needs the seats to be filled.
Right.
Dave Naylor last week talked about how the most important thing in the CFL's future is next season's gate, having 15 to 20,000 people in the stadium in every CFL city for every home game. And if they can't do that, then they're in trouble. And if you're putting out a quality product, then that's fine. But if you're throwing out guys that really don't belong, that don't have that sort of, class of CFL skill, then yeah, people aren't going to come. People aren't going to come and watch the same way that they come and watch now.
I think it's very important to see what deal they make with the players about this season. I think that the onus is on the CFL now to make this right with the players. I just think they have to. I just think that they need to repair this relationship, and they need to come up with a cancellation plan that the players like. I think it's really important. I think teams are going to need to figure out how they can financially, respect the players, come up with a deal that they're not going to get their full salary, but they need to come up with something that is pro player. I really do. I think it's absolutely vital. Because players are, because players will just say, kick rocks. there are lots of American players. They're like, maybe I don't want to go live in Calgary anymore.
The first thing they have to figure out, because this hasn't been 100% nailed down, is what happens to contract status for this season. So if your contract was expiring at the end of the season, are you now a free agent? And most of the players I talk to say yes. They believe right now, what they've heard is that they are free agents. So anyone whose contract was expiring this season, they're no longer under contract with any team. Now, I've heard a few people say that that is still up in the air. That still has to be worked out. But as it stands right now, it looks like anyone that was going to be a free agent at the end of the season is a free agent right now. And that is because of the nature of the CFL and the short contracts that we see. That is a large percentage of the league that is no longer under contract. It always is, but it's usually after the season, a few months before free agency, truly begins. And now suddenly, we're looking at these guys that no longer have a tie. What will that mean?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I'd be curious to see what the players would prefer. I mean, I would guess that the players would prefer for the year not to toll. Looking at it from the outside, I would think it'd be better if this year just didn't happen and next year you get paid the contract.
I think players should have an option on an individual basis. I think that would be a fair move to say to the players, do you want your contract to continue on from where it left off, or do you want that year to toll?
I think they probably have to do an all. I don't think they're going to be able to do that individually.
You're right. It's probably too complex for that.
I mean, the reason I think they probably would not want that, I think they might in other scenarios, but there's not going to be free agent money. So I don't think anyone's getting a better contract than they have right now. That's why I would think the players would not want free agency, because what's free agency going to look like? I don't think it's going to look very lucrative.
And you're talking to players who haven't played football in a year as well, right? And that will be part of the negotiation too.
Nobody's going to be throwing huge numbers at players. I would imagine most players would simply want this year to be deleted and next year simply start where this year would have. I mean, that would be my guess.
So basically a scenario where you have no free agents other than people that aren't currently signed with the team.
Right. I mean, that would be my guess, is what they would prefer.
I think so too. And again, from I haven't talked to everyone in the league, obviously, but I did talk to quite a number of players, and I think that would be something that they would support.
Right. And then that goes back to, again, I think ownership has to step up and come up with a plan that the players want.
If we look at this from an Argos specific angle, and sort of getting away from the other stuff, everything else, and really getting away from what is probably the more important stuff, but just taking a look at this from a football standpoint, from an Argos football standpoint, the Argos are actually in a pretty good scenario next year, just because of the way that this past offseason ran. I guess I don't say past offseason, it's still offseason really, but the Argos, with their massive rebuild, bringing in 68 new players in the offseason, plus draft picks and everything else. The way that they've structured it, they just don't have a lot of free agents this offseason. Almost everybody that they had signed is coming back again. Now, there are a few key guys whose contracts do expire, who are going to be free agents at the end of this year, if the year counts, but not nearly as many as you see on other teams. Other teams that are looking at almost half their roster that have expiring contracts, and the Argos just don't have that scenario. So that could be good for the Argos. Now, unless there's some sort of massive change to the cap, in which case now the Argos are in a lot of trouble, because again, if the amount of money these players are paid going forward because of what happened this year, then that's an entirely different story. But assuming things are the same, the Argos are really in a good situation from a football standpoint.
Yeah, I think that's why. I mean, and we'll see what comes out, but clearly there were some leaks that the Argos led the way to cancel the season. The Argos, from everything that's sort of been leaked, and by looking at that scenario, I think the Argos definitely did not want this season to happen.
It sounds like MLSE was against going ahead with this.
We'll see what's leaked. I think it'll all come out because the Western teams that wanted the league, I don't think they're going to keep quiet about it. I think stuff will come out because, those teams wanted to run it. And, MLSE might have, kind of big time them because it made financial competitive sense to shut it down for MLSE.
So the Argos have, I believe, 22 guys with expiring contracts, which again, it sounds like a lot, but that's actually pretty low for a CFL team. And I haven't done the math on every team. And actually, I don't even have the information from every team, but I would almost guarantee that every other team in the CFL has at least 10 more guys with expiring contracts that are currently on their roster. There are some positions where the Argos will be hit pretty hard, but for the most part, I think they can manage things. The O-line was my immediate concern because that was a concern that we had, coming into the season, and that was a position that we really wanted to see, how it worked out. And they're losing 2 starters there, assuming they can't be re-signed. Isaiah Cage at left tackle and Darius Bladek, who would be a big loss. Randy Richards, of course, as well, but I hadn't penciled him in as a starter. But between Cage and Bladek, Cage, I think they were planning on grooming Theron Churchill to eventually fill in at left tackle, and so that may be a plan they go ahead with. Bladek would be a huge loss because of his experience. He's a really gifted guard and can play center as well, and so that would be a pretty big loss that you'd have to replace. But again, there are going to be other teams where they're talking about 4 starters on the O-line, and we're just really talking about 2. That's not too bad. Receivers, Juwan Bruskeson, Natea J, both are up for their contracts. Levi Noel as well, but Bruskeson and J were definitely going to be starters. That would be a real shame if we can't get these guys back. I was really looking forward to seeing Bruskeson, Ajay, and Brissett Square Force 1 or the Canadian Air Force or whatever nickname you wanted to have for these guys that were all born within blocks of each other, grew up within blocks of each other in Mississauga. To see those 3 guys on the field together, and it's really just Brissett that's going to be under contract going forward. So yeah, that one's a shame. That's a loss. But hopefully those guys can come back and the Argos can figure out a way to get them back in here, because we missed out on that show this year, certainly.
I hope that the Argos do right by them.
Yeah, I would love to see them. Anyone that they're losing, I'd love to see the Argos step up and bring them back again and give them that chance. Because so many of these guys, especially because we're talking about so many local guys that the Argos signed this year, we made such a big deal about how these were Toronto area guys, Mississauga area guys, and they were so excited to come home and to play at home. And it just seems wrong if they never get that opportunity to do so. DBs, that is hit a little harder. Lacombo, Boateng, Darby, all have expiring contracts. Darby's huge. Lacombo, I was really excited about seeing. And Boateng, a guy that has been on the team, that is sort of coming into his own. I was really looking forward to seeing what he could do this year. Hopefully they can get those guys back. And also Radford, Woodson, Colquhoun, but I hadn't written those guys down as potential starters. On the D-line, Craig Rowe, Drake Nevis, Alex Bazzi, all guys that were here on 1-year deals. It's still a pretty strong D-line, but those were all guys that were going to be contributors. Nevis was almost certainly going to be a starter. Rowe and Bazzi probably end up, alternating. And, that's a really sad thing not to get to see those 3 big offseason pickups, 3 guys that we were really excited about. Man, I hope we get a chance to see them play for the Argos. Boris Beatty, another guy, kicker punter Boris Beatty. I was excited to see him. How often does that happen where I'm excited about a punter kicker? But yeah, I was really looking forward to seeing him play. And, he's here on a 1-year deal. Linebackers weren't hit too hard. Chris Aki and Jordan Moore. Chris Aki obviously would be a huge loss, and hopefully they can get him re-signed. But that position wasn't hit too hard. Same with running back, where really it's just Regis Sibassou, whose contract is expiring. The interesting one, quarterback. McLeod Bethel-Thompson on a 1-year deal. Michael Connor in the last of his rookie contract. What do you do there? Is this a situation where, because remember, they signed Bethel-Thompson before signing Matt Nichols, and they clearly believe Nichols is the guy. Do they re-sign Bethel-Thompson?
No, I don't think they do.
See, I think they might, because I think Bethel-Thompson is the perfect backup for Matt Nichols. Matt Nichols is a great quarterback. I'm really excited to seeing Matt Nichols play, seeing what he can do. He's excellent. You watch his film from Winnipeg last year before he got hurt. He looked amazing, and I would love to see him play for the Argos. But he has an injury history, and Bethel-Thompson doesn't. He's been able to stay healthy pretty much his entire career, no matter where he's played. Wouldn't that be the perfect backup for Matt Nichols if you're not thinking he can get through a whole season?
Yeah, maybe. I think it's always challenging to have somebody who was the starter and is now the backup. I just think that dynamic is trickier than having somebody who is the backup. We've talked about where we thought it could be complicated, in terms of who the team supports or who the team wants as their quarterback. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I think he is obviously a great, if you can have a quarterback like him as your backup, I think that's a great asset. I just wonder, if they really want to have a declared starter, I don't know if you would want the former starter as the backup.
It is weird dynamic-wise. I guess it depends on the room. How is that going? Like, what's the chemistry like between them? Is the locker room divided? And hopefully they've got a coaching staff that has managed to be able to avoid that. Well, I'm sure it has to this point because they really haven't been together. But, do they feel that that's a manageable QB room? And if it is, though, I think that's an amazing scenario. Because you remember what it was like for the last few years of Ricky Ray, where he was getting hurt every year. And we'd have to turn to the bench and be like, oh God, now we get the rest of the season with these guys and none of them have ever played before. Like, that's not an ideal scenario. Like Ricky Ray getting hurt after 2 games a couple of years ago. And we had to turn it over to a quarterback room of guys that didn't have any career starts among them. So
yeah,
that's, that's not good either.
Yeah, maybe they signed him once, so.
And Michael O'Connor's contract expires. That's one that, I don't know if he was going to get a fair shot here. I don't think so. And, I don't know if he will. I'm sure he'll get picked up somewhere. I hope for Michael O'Connor that wherever he ends up, whether it's here or somewhere else, that he actually does get a chance to play and does get a chance to show everyone what he can do, regardless of what that is. That at least he has that shot and everyone can now say, okay, we've seen Michael O'Connor play. But I don't know if it's going to be here or not.
No, it's hard. It's hard. It's hard as the number 3 quarterback. You don't get reps. You don't get playing time. And that's a tough road. His only hope is a coach who believes in him.
So looking at this list of guys, would you agree that we are now the Grey Cup favorites going into the 2021 season?
Yeah, no.
But it is interesting, though, because it does put, like, one of the concerns we had this year was, of course, the lack of chemistry. But with a whole year of nobody in the league playing football, everyone is going to start from square one. Like, certainly, having a relationship of some sort helps. But if you haven't played with a guy in a full year, that does matter. I think this helps the Argos in that way too, where suddenly having a whole team full of new guys isn't as bad as it might have been this year, where you're going to go through those 6-7 weeks of growing pains. You're still going to do that, but every team now has to go through at least a few weeks of remembering who everyone is and rebuilding that chemistry they once had. So I think that favors the Argos in a way too, where they shave a little bit of time off that rebuild.
Yeah, I mean, the league being turned upside down, I think, is probably in the Argos' favor.
Because the Argos turned themselves upside down this past year, and so now everyone is kind of going to be in that same boat. Well, that'll just about do it for us today on the X's and Argos podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us. Please don't forget to subscribe, to rate, to tell everyone you know about us. Until next time, for JB, I'm Ben Grant saying so long, and may all your pre-snap reads be good ones. I'll see ya.